So thanks Beryl Quigley and Liam McCloskey for joining us today. You're both from very different backgrounds, and 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you were in very different places from each other. Society would say you would have been on opposing sides, you would have been enemies, and yet in your lives you've been channels of peace. You've taken difficult situations in your life and brought beauty out of them. Beryl, your husband, Bill McConnell, was a prison governor in the early 80s and was killed by the IRA. Liam, you were put in prison in the late 70s and were part of hunger strikes, and were at a time in Northern Ireland when people were dying on the streets and in the prisons. And you have both kind of emerged from those experiences to seek to find empathy and to seek to understand the other side. And recently I was in Derry, Londonderry. We were screening the Guardians of the Flame film, and it was at that screening that you two met each other. And I just was very struck by the fact that how redemption can happen in lives that, you know, maybe we should say they should be enemies, they should be on the other team. Instead, there was a real sense of you're actually both human beings, and you have moved past events of the past and rebuilt lives. And so I'd love to just hear from you a little bit about your stories and those events. So maybe we'll start with you, Liam. You spent time in prison in the early 80s and were part of the hunger strikes, and at the time Beryl's husband would have been working for the prison service in Northern Ireland. How did I guess would be interested to know, how did you get to that place? What was happening maybe in the 70s, Bloody Sunday? How did you get involved in the INLA, the Republican movement?
Okay, I think awareness was raised through the civil rights marches about discrimination in housing. I think it was Dungannon that Austin Curry was very involved in. And it seemed that something was very wrong with Northern Irish society at that point. Then some of my family decided to go into the Civil Rights March on Bloody Sunday, so I was 16 and went with them. As the march went down the hill from the Craigan towards the Bogside, I moved up towards the front, and at the front, when it was stopped in William Street in the Bogside, I was, along with about 400 or 500 other young men, throwing stones and stuff at the army and police that were blocking the road. Got a mouthful of CS gas and was forced to the back of the march because my eyes were burning and throat choking and all that. When I was at the back, the shooting started, but my father and sister and my brother were up in the middle of the shooting, and they were behind a low wall, so they seen a lot of stuff. So afterwards, I was very angry, as most nationalists were at the time, and with the denials of the British troops, and saying that they were all gunmen, had made us very angry. So one night at the pub in Dungiven, soon after this, maybe 6 months, I said to a friend of mine, let's go and join the provost. He says, hold on a minute, there's too much people getting blown up their own bombs. There was a lot of premature explosions in those early days. So we joined the official IRA who were in ceasefire, hoping to get trained. Didn't really happen, I must say. It was more talk about left-wing politics and uniting the Celtic and Protestant working classes, overthrowing the capitalist state, that kind of talks. Then we left the officials. The INLA were formed from the officials, some people not happy that they were ceasefire, and they became active, so we joined them in Dungiven and began to get active in, for example, one of the things I was charged with was hijacking a bus that was a man died in hunger strike in Wakefield Prison in England. He was from Mayo, so when the body was flown to Dublin, the Gardaí commandeered the body and took the coffin to Mayo and buried it encased in concrete in the local graveyard. We were very angry at this happening and felt it was desecration, so we hijacked an Ulster bus coming from Belfast to Derry and pulled it across the road, told the driver to park it across the road and told the passengers to go out and walk down to the RUC station in Dungiven. And this was in the dark of night, a winter's evening. So that was the kind of thing we were involved in. Then there was raids in Dungiven after shootings. There had been a few shootings. There was an RUC man shot dead on Dungiven Main Street and one seriously wounded. Then there was other shootings went on, so there was major raids done. They got one lad, 16 or 17-year-old, 18 he actually was, out of our unit, took him to Castlereagh police station where he talked very quick, unfortunately. But anyway, so we were all swooped the next day and taken to Castlereagh as well. Interrogated, charged with various arms, hijackings, that kind of stuff, and conspiracy to rob arms from security forces. So we went to Crumlin Prison, myself and Kevin Lynch and two other lads that we were sentenced with. I was in the cell with Kevin, and we talked about, plus there was a parade every Sunday on the Crumlin Road where all the Republican prisoners would line up and hold them in signs for dead volunteers. Then they would give us short talk, so it was often Bobby Sands giving the talk, and it was about political status being removed, and we weren't criminals, we were there for political reasons, therefore we were to resist and not wear the prison uniform once we were sentenced. So we knew that was what was coming down the line. I myself wasn't overly happy about it, but I was there and felt I had to do it. So put into a sentence to 10 years after about a year on remand in the end of 1977, and went into the Maze Prison. Put into cells naked because we wouldn't wear the uniform, so we wrapped us up in blankets. The blanket protest was about 6 months old at that point. There was about 100 other men on it, and it grew over the next few months, but it also escalated into, we decided there wasn't enough news about it on the outside, propaganda, so and there was issues going on inside, so all the furniture in the cells was smashed the windows, and refused to wash or use the toilets in the prison, and used the inside of the cells as toilets. And then there was wing moves every 10 days, 2 weeks, often a bit of violence used by warders. Plus there was, sometimes we were taunting the warders from the windows as they walked into work, so one fed off the other. And the H Block blanket protest was an aggressive one. The warders were aggressive, and it's only afterwards I could understand coming from clean homes into a smelly, dirty wing with a corridor full of pee. Wouldn't have been the most pleasant experience first thing in the morning. It was only afterwards I thought those kind of things, but during that time I had a lot of time to reflect. The only thing to read in the cell was the Bible, so I decided it was the only time in my life I would have the time or take the time to read the Bible. So I decided to read like a book from start to finish. Some of it very heavy going, I must say, in the Old Testament, the son of the son of the son of and all that stuff. But I kept to it anyway, and as things progressed on, I fancied myself as a young Marxist when I was in. But I began to pray. Kevin, oddly enough, had more faith than I had at the start, and we shared that cell. And I was arguing with him. You know, he was getting in at the start. We were allowed in religious magazines, and there was people giving thanks for passing driving tests and passing exams and all that. And I would say, well, these things would have happened anyway, whether they prayed or didn't pray. They were going to pass their tests and pass the exams if they'd done enough work, preparation. But he was saying it's their faith that helped them. So eventually I thought, well, maybe there might be something to this. And I began to pray, and seriously, I suppose, because at times I was praying but not really thinking much about the prayers. It was just a rigmarole of words. But as I prayed the Lord's Prayer, or the Our Father, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us, I thought to myself, what does that mean for me here now on the Dart protest in H3? And I thought, well, that means anybody I have a problem with, I need to forgive, really. The British Army, RUC, warders, anybody else. And being part of a fairly aggressive protest, I was finding that a difficult concept to get my head around, but I was also beginning to pray a prayer of St. Francis, make me an instrument of your peace. And a line in that struck me and made me think was that I should understand rather than be understood. So I thought to myself, again, what does that mean? I thought, well, if maybe had I been born in England, working class area, joined the British Army, sent to Northern Ireland, not knowing very much about it except a few things told before we went to Northern Ireland, could have got shot, and it wouldn't have changed many lives except those close to me. Or I could have been born in a Protestant family, very law and order orientated, and ended up in the RUC. So it was those kind of thoughts. I began to think more outside the box, if you like. And looking back on it, I think I was led, I know I was led by the Holy Spirit, really. And slowly I began to make moves. Like an example was 79, I think it was, when Lord Mountbatten was killed and 19 paratroopers in narrow water. We got news out at lunchtime. We all cheered at the doors. This is great, a big victory for the IRA Republicans. And that night I prayed for their souls, and I thought, you can't do that. You can't cheer for their deaths and then pray for their souls in the evening. So there's those kind of small incremental steps lead me along until I realised near the end probably of the blanket protest that I probably wouldn't be involved again once I got outside. But I still hadn't made a decision one way or the other. I was still the foot in each camp, if you like. Foot in God's camp and a foot in Republican camp. But I knew I would have to make a decision one way or the other. In the meantime, the hunger strikes had started. Kevin and myself both put our names down after much thought. We had about a week or two to think about it before we volunteered for it. So we put our names down, and I was half hoping it would never come to that. But first hunger strike failed. Second one began under Bobby's hands, and most people know the history of that deaths happened. So there was, INLE were a small group within the prison, and Kevin was the third INLE volunteer to go on that hunger strike after the other two had died. So as he was going towards his end, I thought it was my turn next, and I need to really focus on, no matter what psychological pressure, what physical pain, no matter what comes, go on to this hunger strike, see it through. Don't stop, no matter what happens. So Kevin died, and I prepared myself, and the next day, I think, or the day after, I was on hunger strike to take his place. And as I was on hunger strike, there was about 3 people died. But things began to change in that there was a priest on the outside, Father Dennis Fall, who was very active on justice issues on behalf of the Republican movement, on behalf of the nationalists, I suppose. And he had called a meeting in Tombridge and decided that the only way to weaken the hunger strike or to end it, because you had Margaret Thatcher and the Conservatives hard as a rock on one side, ourselves determined and hard on the other side, and neither of the two were going to give way. In the meantime, we were dying, people on the streets were dying, and it was causing a lot of tension in the streets in Northern Ireland. So he asked the families to intervene once we lost consciousness. Most of the hunger strikers died after going into a coma for about 3 days or 4 days perhaps before they died. During that time, parents began to take their sons off hunger strike. So even though that was happening, and deep down I knew the hunger strike was on its last legs, I felt I couldn't stop. So oddly enough, because of my prayer and thinking about the life of Jesus, I thought 40 days without food must be reasonably safe, because he fasted for 40 days in the desert. And it turned out that way. That wasn't, the first 4 weeks was all hunger, 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 and then the next few weeks were quite normal. Felt not too bad inside, and quite normal walking about the prison hospital. Then around day 50, or probably before that, my eyesight began to go, and it began to flicker, so that meant I got very sick, throwing up, and the only thing I had was water and a bit of a stomach bite, but that seemed to get worse and worse each day, until finally I thought I can't take much more of this, and I prayed that night that it would stop, and the next day I was blind, so then it did stop. So blind for about 4 or 5 days, then on Saturday morning, a local priest came in from Dungiven, and he began to talk. As soon as I heard his voice, I thought, he's going to talk me off the hunger strike, don't let him do it. But one thing he said to me, that Kevin had said to him not to allow me to die the way he was dying, and that kind of got to me. Although I didn't show it, and then my mother came in, which was a surprise. I wasn't expecting her in. And she said, she had talked to an eye specialist, she said, if I went on the hunger strike much longer, I might be permanently blind. And she asked me to stop. So I said, no, I'm keeping going. And then the next thought I had was, that's not fair to her. It would be the better thing to do for me to stop, take all responsibility for stopping the hunger strike on my own head, not putting hers. So I decided, rather than wait until a coma came and my mother had to intervene, I would stop. 1 week later, the following Saturday, the hunger strike was over, called off by the professional IRA, and I probably wouldn't have lived that week. I would have died sometime over that week. I had been kept going. But anyway, I was taken to Musgrave Park Hospital, got a couple of injections, and my eyesight began to return fairly fast. Very blurred, but coming back. And I was there in the hospital, between that hospital and the prison hospital, for about 7 weeks. During that time, I had to think seriously about my republicanism on one side and spiritual journey on the other. I reached a stage where I had to choose between one and the other, and decided that the call of, that I couldn't walk away from the spiritual side of life, that the call of faith, of Jesus, of God, whatever way people want, whatever words people want to put in these things, but that was the way to go. So I decided to give my life to God, and shortly afterwards sent a small letter of resignation out to the NLA outside. They came to see me and tried to make sure that I was, that it was true and all that. They seemed to accept it. I asked them to move to McGilligan prison, and there were mixed prayer meetings, which I attended, run by a group called Prison Fellowship. There was a priest I had met, or I had seen in the H3, who was helping to run it. He had said Mass just the week before I went on hunger strike. And just before he spoke at the sermon, I could see something in his eyes that told me what this man was saying would be right, and he spoke with compassion for the hunger strikers, but he said it was wrong. It wasn't the right thing to do. That we should find some other way. It was putting their own lives at risk and causing strife outside, which I thought was a brave enough word to give to a crowd of blanket men during a very emotive hunger strike. So he was there in that mixed prayer meeting, and a Baptist man, Presbyterian, and a man from a small Christian church. And there was former loyalist prisoners, mostly ex-UVF. UDA didn't seem to get touched as much for some reason or other. And a handful of ex-Republican prisoners, and some, as they used to say, in their ordinary decent criminals. And through that, I was introduced to the loyalist side of things, and talking to loyalist lads in there, I realised beyond all doubt that we had this philosophy that once we got to United Ireland, that the Unionist Protestant people would accept it, would get used to the idea. Talking to these loyalist guys and seeing just how immersed they were in the British culture and all that, I thought that's not going to happen, that they will suddenly lie down and give in to United Ireland. So I thought the whole Republican philosophy, they don't really get just how unionist people here are. And I made good friends with some former UVF men in there, and I was involved with some of them giving talks when they got out of prison. And through them I met a guy called Billy Wright, who was a very well known UVF man in Portadown, who told me when I met him that his heart had been opened by God and he had a great love for Catholics. And Billy and I met a few times, and we gave a talk to a youth club in Portadown on our faith. Yet shortly after that, Billy got involved with the local evangelical church that was very anti-Catholic, really. Pope's the Antichrist and all Catholics are followers of the Antichrist, all that. So I could see Billy begin to close back down again, and I pulled away from him. And shortly after that, he was back into the UVF and was very involved in the Duncree protests. So I thought that was unfortunate. It was probably a mixture of evangelical church and Billy's own ego of being the hard man and put it down. And he ended up getting shot, ironically enough, by Lionel Lee in a prison van, getting killed, which I was sorry to say. I liked him as a person, if he just had been able to keep walking away from it all. And his wife was the daughter of an RUC man who had been shot by the IRA, and she was also a lovely woman as well. So I got involved in that kind of stuff when I got out, and some of the guys inside thought that the hunger strike had affected my head, but I might be all right after a while. It was the kind of attitude. I don't think they realised the depth of spiritual experience, and then once you take that journey and forgive people, which is, I think, for Northern Ireland is very important, that people are able to forgive, or another language you could say, to let go. A friend of mine recently I was talking to in England, her lifelong partner said to her she needs to let go of childhood hurts that she had from her father and others. And she attends yoga type classes. She would call herself an atheist, but a very good woman. And I thought, well, letting go is another, I said to her, letting go is another word for forgiveness. You're letting things go so that Margaret Thatcher or the British Army or whoever you happen to hate is not taking up a huge space in your head, that you have a much healthier life if you can let go, if you can forgive. And the people in Northern Ireland can let go and forgive, they will be much happier and society will heal. That will be my message.
Thanks, Liam.
Okay.
So maybe Beryl, can you tell us what your life was like in the 70s, early 80s, and the events leading up to your husband's death.
Right. In the 70s, I was living life to the full. I was single, living in North Belfast with my parents. North Belfast in those days was quiet. I grew up in a family where we didn't talk about Catholics or Protestants. It just wasn't part of the culture that I grew up in. And North Belfast in those days had most of the Jewish community because the synagogue was in North Belfast, and historically Jewish people walked to the synagogue on Saturday mornings. And so I grew up in a very safe, normal home. Politics wasn't talked about. My parents were Protestants, and almost certainly they would have voted Unionist in those days, but there was never any talk about it. So I was never, I feel that I was never really influenced by my parents as to what I should be thinking. And I was out dancing night after night and working in the civil service and really enjoying life to the full in the 70s. And then I was introduced to Bill McConnell by a friend who thought we would be a good match. And as it turned out, we did make a couple, and we had a courtship. And then in 1979, in the spring, we got married and set up home. At that stage, Bill was working in Crumlin Road Prison, and he had come to faith as a young fella in school, maybe about 16, 17 years of age. And when he was at school, he had been taken with some of his school friends to a borstal institution in Malile. And he'd been very taken by the fact that these bad boys actually were clean and neat and tidy and really very well mannered, probably because of the discipline of the regime that was going on, to try to help these young men get their lives back together again and come out better than they went in. And I think those were the days when Bill was forming in his own mind what he might do beyond a university degree. And sure enough, when he graduated from Queen's, he applied to the Northern Ireland Prison Service and got a post as an assistant governor and served in several of the prisons in Northern Ireland at different stages, getting experience and getting 1 or 2 promotions on the way. So whenever we were courting and when we were engaged, I was very aware that the troubles were well and truly happening in Northern Ireland, and I was aware that I was going to be marrying somebody who could have become a target in a very real sense. The prison service weren't really getting many people being targeted, but it was beginning to happen. And Bill had lost some of his colleagues through shootings and bombings. But life for us was just fairly normal. Bill went to work in the morning. In the early 80s, he was in the Maze Prison, probably around the time that Liam was on the Dirty protest, because I know that was going on. Bill didn't talk about work. I didn't really know what went on. He did actually say at one stage that it can be quite scary, because he said, as you're walking down the wing, people will say, oh, we know where you live, or we know your car registration number. And he said, it does make you realise that you're not anonymous, that it's a small place, this Northern Ireland, and people can find out who you are and where you live. And so he told things like that to me, and he said, just be careful, just keep your eye out. But, to be truthful, you don't know what to look for. A terrorist isn't going to come up with, something written across his T-shirt. He or she is just going to be one of the people you see around. And it was in March 1984 when, the whole story is that about 9 o'clock on the Monday night, 2 guys came to our neighbours across the road. Our neighbours were in their late 80s. Very gentle, elderly people, and these 2 guys sort of burst in. They didn't have any guns at that stage, but the neighbours were sort of held not physically bound, but put in a room, told to go to bed, and not to call out or do anything. There were no mobile phones in those days, really. And later on that evening, someone that apparently was known as the jogger, because there was lots of people jogging around the area, getting fit, he delivered a gun, or 2 guns perhaps. And the next morning, this was all totally unknown to us, but the next morning, about 8 o'clock, while Bill was finishing off his breakfast, I went outside to our family car, checked underneath. I'd been told to check in case there was anything different. I wasn't sure what I'd be looking for, but I checked anyway. And then Bill came out and we said our farewells, and he hugged and kissed me and our little daughter, who was 3. And as this was all going on, I could see out of the corner of my eye something happening across the road. And because our neighbours were elderly, and I wouldn't normally have seen anything happening at 8 o'clock, 10 past 8 in the morning, I looked and saw 2 young men coming out of the side door, and with guns, and I realised that this was almost certainly a time when Bill's life was going to be in huge danger. And I called to him. He looked, saw what was happening. These young men were almost upon him. He turned and began to run towards our back garden, and gunfire commenced, and Bill died within a few seconds of receiving several bullets in his head and chest. I was crouching around on the floor around the car, trying to avoid being shot, and our little daughter ran into the house screaming. When they had felt that they'd come to finish what they had come to do, they retraced their steps and got into our neighbour's car, which was being driven by another person, and drove off. And then I began a life of being a lone parent with a small child and adjusting to what life was like in Northern Ireland in 1984 with the troubles going on. I have to say, one of the almost daily things that happened was at tea time, when I was watching the television news, hearing about the latest awful shootings or bombings, I was hearing people screaming at the camera saying, I hope they catch the people involved and throw them into prison and throw away the key. And they were really, really bitter and hurting so much. And I thought, how are they ever going to be able to adjust to life without their loved ones? And my heart broke for people who had no hope. I had a faith. It wasn't hugely strong, but it was growing day by day as I felt I needed to call upon God to help me to live a life that was not bitter and to bring up a small child.
Did you get the BBC or news cameras come to your house after that happened, Beryl?
Yes, there were interviews about how I was feeling. I think it happened in most cases in Northern Ireland. And I was able to talk about my feelings, which were that I wasn't spitting hate about the people who had done this. I'd had, as a result of the whole shooting, a real sense that God was speaking to me. I know we read about it in the Bible, but it does happen that God does speak to us by His Spirit. And God was reminding me about the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father prayer, that talks about forgiving others. And that challenged me. And my feeling was, Lord, if you're asking me to forgive the people who have shot and killed Bill so that I can live a life that you will bless, then I'm going to choose to forgive. But Father God, you're going to have to help me every day, because I wouldn't have the strength to do that on my own. And God has been faithful every day since the 6th of March 1984. He has given me the strength of purpose and the grace to be able to keep on forgiving and not to have thoughts of hatred and bitterness towards the people who were involved, or indeed the whole business of a divided community that we have in Northern Ireland.
So, what is beautiful is that years later, the two of you can sit together and tell your stories, but probably early 80s, you were on opposite sides, you know, and in a way, I suppose what's brought you together is partly time, but it's also been that journey of forgiveness that you've both been on. I wonder, Beryl, what is your memory of the early 80s when you know, the hunger strikes were on? Do you have any kind of memories of that time? What did you think of Republican prisoners? Did you have in your mind a kind of, how did you envisage them? Did you see them as enemies, or did you have compassion for them? Or?
I saw them as, I think they were mostly men. I think I saw them as mostly young men who felt passionately about their culture and about what they were hoping and dreaming for. I was desperately, desperately concerned that they were going to starve themselves to death, because I kept thinking about the waste of a young life, and I kept thinking of their families, because it's only when you lose a loved one that you realize what a devastating hole that creates in your own life and in society, in your neighborhood, in just so many ways. And that hurt me, that grieved me, that people were actually going to die for something that they felt very passionately about.
Yeah, it seems like both of you had the journey of empathy. You know, you were able to kind of put yourself in the shoes of the other person. Like Liam, you were talking about kind of imagining what it would have been like if you'd been born in England and if you'd been a British soldier. And it's like empathy seems to be like an ingredient in lives getting changed. You know, the ability to see it from their perspective. Were you able to do that, Liam?
Yes, I think empathy was important. That I may understand rather than be understood was a key, if you like, to unlock a door to a new insight, to a new way of thinking about things. If you only look about that you're right and everybody else is wrong, it doesn't give you any growth. But once you start to think maybe the other person, how they might think, it gives you much better insight, as you say, empathy. And as Beryl was saying about forgiveness, it takes a strength, it takes a spiritual strength and inner strength. Wherever people can get that from, whatever name they want to put on it, I believe it's a spiritual strength, it's a strength of God. But if people can find within themselves to forgive, to let go, then it will help them and help society, as I've said before. And it's an important key if you want to move ahead.
How did you envisage, like, I asked Beryl, like, how did she see, you know, the prisoners or people on hunger strike? What was your kind of image at the time of, like, a governor of the prison or assistant governor?
We hadn't much, I hadn't much experience of governors as such. As was saying to Beryl before, the only time they came round the blocks, I think it was to do something about taking days off us. We were sentenced to 10 years, but at that time in Northern Ireland you were served 5 years, but we were losing a day's remission for every day we were on the blanket protest. So every so often they would come round to read out some short statement. Opened up all our doors, which must have been a bit of a culture shock for them. But anyway, what we were doing at that point was taking up empty poles in the cell and beating the hell out of the walls so we couldn't hear anything and what was going on, and making life kind of hard for them, I suppose. So we seen them as part of the enemy grouping, if you like. As Beryl was saying, prison officers began to be targeted more, especially during that dirt protest, because there was a lot of stories going to the outside about things happening inside, beatings and all that. And that was the justification for guys outside going after prison officers, prison governors and all that. They seen them as part of the British war machine in Republican terms. It was only once I began to pray and began to reflect on things that I could see for them coming in from clean homes to a dirty, smelly prison wing would have been tough going. And most of them would have been from Protestant backgrounds, unionist backgrounds. So they would have seen us as the enemy. So there was that kind of tension between the two groups. I think after the hunger strikes were over, there was a move within the Republican circles to befriend the warriors, but that was there was an end game in that they wanted to see if there's any weakness in the security and all that, and eventually that led to the Maze escape. So the friendliness there was a false one. It wasn't a real. It was a means to an end.
I wonder if we could talk a wee bit about forgiveness. And sometimes we frame forgiveness as a decision, which it is, but it's also a journey, I suppose, and people experience it in different ways. What was it like for you? Maybe for you first, Beryl, as a kind of in the days, weeks, months afterwards, you know, shortly after your husband was killed, you made a decision to forgive, but what did that look like months later?
It didn't make an enormously big difference in my life, except in my mind. I would have listened to news bulletins and some of the political statements that were part of the news with a more open mind, realizing that there are agendas on both sides of every argument. And I suppose really it started to create in me a greater desire to listen to somebody else's story. Because it's only as you listen to their story that you begin to hear something of their heartbeat and something of the questions they're asking themselves of life in general. So it didn't really make an awful lot of difference in those early days because I was taken up with caring for a small child. In later years, it has allowed me, with my new wonderful husband, to be more inclusive. And so we have sought to attend some things that I wouldn't normally have done in the past. It has allowed us to, on one occasion for a few years, we were part of a cross-community prayer group. And that was a wonderful time of fellowship with people that I wouldn't normally have met. And it was a learning curve, because in some ways we sort of talk about things with different words, but actually we mean the same. And it's coming to realize that words can throw up certain things because of the way we've been taught or the way our culture has formed those meanings in our lives. And in fact, we need to learn how to hear what somebody is saying. I hope I'm a much more tolerant person. I hope I'm more long-suffering. I hope I'm still listening and trying to understand what someone else has been through, so that I can have a greater understanding of their hurts and their difficulties and why they think the way they do.
And what about you, Liam? What did forgiveness look like in an ongoing way for you?
In an ongoing way, it's, as Beryl was saying, it created more tolerance for people, but even in our day-to-day lives, there are times when you could be hurt by someone, or someone is doing something on you and you feel that you should be doing something strong against it, but and you have to struggle to let go. It's not, because we have had that, it doesn't mean that in our daily lives we don't at times struggle with it, but it's well worth trying to come out on the forgiveness side at all times. Even though sometimes you feel you're being a bit soft in the head by doing that, but it makes you much better, really, because you don't have to think so much. When, like, for example, there was a piece of land that my father had bought with cash, a farmer in Donegal, overlooking a beach, and my mother left it to me. When I got out, the man who sold the land was ill, and Holly wouldn't let my mother on to talk to him, so his son got the land, and it was in dispute at that point. There was no evidence as such and all that. So I was having problems letting that go, but I at the end up did, and it means you don't have to think about all that. Your brain is not taken up on your mind about how you go to this and how you go to that, and getting annoyed at this guy seemingly hanging on to something that's not his. And so even for small things in everyday life, people still have to make that choice. And even that time, it's worked out much better. I don't have to get stressed about all of that. Just let it go and get on with your life.
Mm-hmm. So one of the recent events was the shooting of a young woman in Derry, Lyra McKay. And it does bring back the kind of the spectre of what would it be like if these events all started to happen again. I suppose if you both were to look back and think, how could we make sure it doesn't happen again? What would be the ingredients? Liam, do you think of making sure we don't return to the kind of the escalation of violence
I think
of the 70s?
Each community needs to have more respect for the views of the other and take them more into account. Plus, I think that there are areas in Northern Ireland, and as there are elsewhere, where there is unemployment, deprivation, and young men in those kind of environments are easily sucked into things like the dissident Republicans. In England, it would be gangs and knives and all that. Here, because of the political backdrop, it becomes guns and violence. So there's a vacuum there, and I think that the Assembly, if it was back working together and working properly, not working with a lot of friction, it would help to create the environment where things can move on. Again, people need to be able to let go of past feelings of hurt. There's a lot of, and on the union side, a lot of people believe that all the violence was from the IRA, and that if they hadn't been about, Northern Ireland would be around any place. But you need to realise that there was a lot going on before that led up to the violence that caused the outbreak. The reaction from young men like myself that weren't evil men as such, but were just caught up in reactions. And these young guys in the Craigan that shot Lyra, you would hope that they will, even by that happening, will be able to reflect and somehow move beyond that. But the conditions and what they're hearing around them needs to be more reconciliatory, I suppose. People need to try to learn to tone down their language. Careless talk costs lives, as it said during the Second World War. And people need to realise that being very loud and aggressive in their talk to one another doesn't create conditions for peace. And people need to reflect, and if they get time and space, just to think about the other, try and understand.
Mm. And what about you, Beryl, when you think about Lyra's shooting last week? How do we get to a place in a society where we don't repeat the past, and what do we need to do today that would be different than maybe what we did back in the 60s and 70s?
Well, I think we have to try and learn from history and put the things that we learn for good into practice. There's so many things, there's so many strands. Yes, unemployment can create vacuums. Young people get sucked into organisations. In our parents' and grandparents' days, they were all working hard, and they didn't have time to do much except just work and look after families. We're less family orientated now. People have more free time. They've got time to think. I think the politicians have a lot to answer for, because for some, they shout and tell us that if we don't vote for them, the others will get in and overrule us. And that puts fears into people, and fear is a terrible, terrible thing. It's insidious. I think the fact that we don't have our MLAs at Stormont working, they're beginning to talk now in small groups to see if they can get back into discussing the things that need to be discussed in Northern Ireland. I think church leaders need to do a whole lot about talking, not belittling other people in other denominations, but teaching people more about the heartbeat of Christ, which was inclusive and forgiving and tolerant and walking humbly. And I think the ordinary 5/8 people need to do more about reaching out to people and accepting people irrespective of their colour or their class or their creed or their alliance to a football team or whatever. You know, we've got to start appreciating people for their sake rather than somehow putting labels on them before we've even met them. It's this business of listening to their story. So there's a lot of things need to be done in a lot of areas. We can't do them all, but we can each of us start somewhere. Me in my small corner, I can start doing something today to make a difference in my area of influence. And if we all did a little bit, taking one small step forward, maybe we could make some difference for good. I would hope so, because we've got children and grandchildren coming on after us, and they're not going to thank us for the political state that we've left this country in, or for the state that we're leaving this planet in.
Yeah. So thanks, Liam and Beryl, for taking the time to be with us. You know, the phrase that we use for this documentary series is being guardians of the flame, and I think you've shown with your lives what it means to live a life of faith that is not about dogmatic religion and separating yourselves from others, but actually breaking down walls and building bridges. And what I really appreciate in hearing your stories is has been your ability to show empathy, to find out what it would be like to walk in the shoes of the other side. And by doing so, you have created a channel of peace. You've become peacemakers, and it seems like in Northern Ireland and around the world, we need peacemakers right now. We need people who are not just going to take a side and other people and build walls, but to build bridges, to find common ground. And so thanks for being that, and thanks for being peacemakers in Northern Ireland for many years. And I think you give us all hope.
Thank you.
Yeah.